The chorus in particular, the bit penned by Paul McCartney, is so easy to sing along to. It has the balance that you often get in nursery rhymes.
They might not know they're never going to play live again, but they're accepting that their creations will never be performed.
He's really ahead of his time with sampling. Like, they definitely wouldn't have been on the right side of copyright law. The original that John wrote was in this kind of unusual 6/8 time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
And the third seat along is Keith Richards from the Stones. So I walked down with my pal and I said, "Excuse me, is anyone sitting there?" He says, "Nah, you're okay, it's Mick and Marianne." But so I sat next to Keith Richards, literally behind Paul McCartney that night.
It's early summer in 1966. Longleat Safari Park has opened in Wiltshire, becoming the first drive-through safari outside of Africa. Harold Wilson's Labour Party are enjoying a healthy majority in Parliament after calling a snap election in the spring. Everton have defeated Sheffield Wednesday to win the FA Cup at Wembley. Audiences are enjoying The Frost Report on BBC One, which goes on to launch the careers of the two Ronnies and members of Monty Python. And the Moors murderers, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, are sentenced to life imprisonment for the killing of 3 children in one of Britain's most shocking news stories. Meanwhile, the Beatles are enjoying more musical freedom and spending more time crafting their songs in the studio than ever before. They set out to write a novelty children's song sprinkled with comedy and hijinks, creating Yellow Submarine. This is UnBeatled, the show where each episode we delve deep into one song recorded by the Fab Four. With the help of a specialist, we examine the history, writing, recording and impact of the song, while our resident musician unpicks the lyrics and music. I'm joined by Beatles expert and music industry insider David Stark, and musician and Fab Four fanatic Dave Bennett. So please me, and subscribe, like and comment to UnBeatled with Donny Campbell on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Today we break down their 13th single, Yellow Submarine. So David, Yellow Submarine comes out in 1966. It's a children's song, it's a novelty. What was that like? A bit of a left field turn for the Beatles.
Well, I was a child when it came out. I was 13 years old, and wow, this is a new direction for the Beatles. But of course it was a double A side of Eleanor Rigby, which we'll talk about another time. But yeah, I mean, Yellow Submarine, it was just, wow, it's just a kid's song, very, very enjoyable, interesting subject matter, and great lyrics and great sounds. It was another Beatles, you know, production, like, wow, we'd never heard anything quite like this before. What's going on?
And now we think of it as this sort of chant-along children's rhyme. Was it like that as soon as it came out? Were people, you know, singing it in the playground and
I think so, as far as I remember. It was very, yeah, sing-along. And there's still, of course, anything the Beatles did, people latched on to straight away. So I'm sure within a few days or a week, everyone's singing it, yeah, in the playgrounds and in the canteens at work. Yeah.
And Dave, we take it for granted that it's almost like part of our childhood growing up, especially myself. And, you know, I think we sang it in school, and it just becomes another one along with Humpty Dumpty. But why? How was it so iconic, so memorable?
I think it has that very simple binary form, you know, verse, chorus, and the chorus in particular, the bit penned by Paul McCartney, is so easy to sing along to. It has the balance that you often get in nursery rhymes, where you have the first phrase, and then, so that's the first half. Second half starts with the tail end of the first, so it's no more information, just the same bit again. There's nothing you really have to pay attention to. You can hear it once and you can sing along, but the beauty of this track is, although from a compositional standpoint it might seem simple, the arrangement, the clever studio tricks, the sound effects that we'll get talking about in this episode, turn it into a Beatles track, make it interesting, keep you listening.
Yes, it's a contrast between a very simple but lovely melody, children's sing-along song with a lot of special effects and stuff going on.
Groundbreaking stuff as well. Like this song might be one of the first examples of sampling with the marching band sample. And we've got vari speed, where the tape speed's been played around with, lots of clever little things.
So that's sort of the context behind this song, is the Beatles have, at this point, they might not have known it at the time, they have played their last ever concert in the UK, and they're spending a lot more time in the studio. They know Revolver, the album that Yellow Submarine is on, is not going to be reproduced live.
Yeah.
And they're sort of accepting that. They might not know they're never going to play live again, but they're accepting that their creations will never be performed. The first song they recorded for Revolver was Tomorrow Never Knows,
which very much is a song you couldn't do live. But even Yellow Submarine, as we were saying, you could do a more rudimentary form of it live, but you couldn't create the full magic of it.
And so we'll talk about the writing of Yellow Submarine. Supposedly it came to Paul, as he says some songs, or a lot of songs have, in a sort of dreamlike state in bed.
Yeah. I mean, who knows how the mind works and how Paul McCartney's mind was working in those days. But yeah, he was getting influences from songs in all directions. So quite possibly in a dream or just as you're waking up. And
he says it was fertile ground for songwriting, that sort of dreamlike state.
Yes.
You know, what Let It Be came from a dream, he says. So
Yesterday, most famously, as well.
Yesterday as well, of course.
Yes.
So he's...
it's that thoughtful moment where
song.
You're just wandering off, and I imagine particularly his mind is all thinking through all these ideas, and suddenly you think, oh. But it was the chorus that would have been the bit he wrote, the "We all live in a yellow submarine." It was the verse was written by John Lennon, and the two were paired together. And as we'll talk about in a bit, the verse section by John was originally quite different in not necessarily in melody, but in time signature, in the rhythm of it. But they then eventually found ways to marry it all together. And I don't think you would know now that the two sections began as separate entities.
That's the thing, because everyone gives this song as credited to Paul. It's very much deemed a Paul song written for Ringo.
It feels like a Paul song, yeah.
And even throughout the years, Paul has claimed to have fully written it. And I think John gave him sort of the claim. But as we found out in the demo was released in 2022, John wrote the melody of the verses.
Yeah, I always considered it more of a John song than Paul, not knowing who wrote what back in the day. And of course, you've got John, chirping in on bits of it as well. But of course, it's Ringo who sings it. The first single with Ringo as lead vocalist by the Beatles.
Yeah.
So, and that was another. Wow, it's Ringo.
Yeah.
And it's his moment in 1966. Yeah.
And supposedly, because he knew Ringo was going to sing it, he didn't make it too rangy and vocally, so that Ringo could get it.
A simple melody.
A simple melody,
yeah.
And sorry, go on.
Yeah, and of course it's another great iconic lyric, Ringo, in the town where I was born, and that's going to be Liverpool.
Yeah,
of course.
yeah, it paints that picture, and you can imagine, a mariner, a submarine in Liverpool, docking in the port there. So yeah, it's all on brand.
And other influences that contributed to the writing of Yellow Submarine, a lot of people, again, we're mentioning him again, Bob Dylan, link Rainy Day Woman, Bob Dylan's single, released just a month prior to the recording.
Okay.
They'll stone you when they try to do so good.
Oh yeah, it's got that kind of crowd, that kind of feeling of a crowd locked up in a cabin.
Crowd energy, yeah.
And I think that would have come into it. And they actually met Bob Dylan the night before recording this. So Bob Dylan is on the mind.
When he was in London.
When he was in London, to perform that famous tour of the UK where he was booed and called Judas, and you get that classic line of "I don't believe you."
So it was all happening in that week where England had just won the World Cup 5 days earlier at Wembley.
Wow.
That was literally just
so
before.
so much history compiled there.
So after writing it, Paul is struggling with a couple of lines as well, and he knocks on Donovan's door.
Yeah. Was it Sky of Blue and Sea of Green was the Donovan contribution.
Contributed by Donovan.
Yeah.
And there's a great story of Paul when he goes to meet Donovan. He parks his Aston Martin outside illegally. I think he just sort of rolls it onto the curb or something.
Yeah.
And a police officer comes to the door and goes, "Is that your car outside parked illegally?" And then Paul pops up behind Donovan. And the police officer goes, "Oh, Mr. McCartney," and then takes his keys and goes and parks it for him.
Very nice of him. Yeah. But that's a nice contribution by Donovan, very much in his style as well.
Nice bit of imagery. And it plays into the colour, the psychedelic element of it, blue, green, yellow submarine. It's just very sort of...
And of course, Donovan had a hit called Colours as well.
True.
And let's talk about the recording, because the whole fun of Yellow Submarine is the way it was recorded and sort of the aspects and the playing around with effects and noises and hoots and whistles, etc. They had a party in the studio to record all of that.
Okay.
Yeah. To capture that energy, and it really does capture that energy. And they got loads of sort of like chains to rattle and bells to ding and all sorts of things to muck around with.
Brian Jones was clinking glasses, and they were just having a lot of fun. Fuel 60s style, I believe.
Yeah, Paul was blowing bubbles, as you can hear on the track.
And there's a great story of John wanted to sound like he was underwater. So he got a microphone and they wrapped a condom around it and they put it in a bucket of water. And then when the studio owner or proprietor came into the room, John hid it behind his back. The manager, hid it behind his back, like giggling school kids. Which is a great story, and you can hear the fun they're having.
Well, that section, of course, the instrumental was really kind of would have been the middle eight, but it's just and that's what makes it interesting, because we couldn't quite hear what was going on back in the day on the vinyl, and it's like only years later you can hear it a bit more clearly. But of course it was fascinating. So many sounds, and John putting on silly voices, and it was a real underwater madness. Yeah, it was.
Oh, and it was this approach they had for various songs where they would lay down the rhythm track and leave spaces, knowing they'd come back later to put things in. And initially that would be things like guitar solos or maybe a keyboard solo on the odd thing like In My Life. But here, they just filled it with all sorts of random effects and stuff, including the marching band, which I always assumed that was, musicians they had hired. But in fact, it's a sample. It's a sample taken from an old marching band tune, French marching band tune. And George Martin found a recording that was supposedly in the same key as Yellow Submarine and then played around with it. I imagine what he did is adjusted the tape speed to make it fit. It may have even not been in the correct key, and he used tape speed to bring it into key. But he's really ahead of his time with sampling. Like, they definitely wouldn't have been on the right side of copyright law, but they got away with it.
Well, presumably it was the band marching band was released on EMI, so they wouldn't have to worry.
Yeah, I imagine so. Yeah.
Well, explain what's happening musically. We've touched on how the verses and the choruses were written by John and Paul and then paired together to create one whole song.
Yeah, well, let me show you on the guitar. So there's these demos released more recently of John performing the original verse on guitar. And it was originally written in the key of G. The recording we have is basically in the key of G flat. I say basically because it's slightly out of concert pitch because of the tape speed. They recorded it in G, slowed it down to the key of G flat. But originally written in G. And interestingly, unlike the final version, which is in a sort of swung 4/4 time, which you might describe as 12/8 time, 4/4 but swung. The original that John wrote was in this kind of unusual 6/8 time. And not just, 6/8 isn't particularly unusual, but the way John had grouped it, he grouped it in 4 and 2. So you'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1. And although eventually they would then iron out that time signature into more conventional 4/4 time to make it match what Paul had written, you can still feel that unusual timing in the chord changes, because they're now, rather than it being groups of 4 and 2, the 4/4 time is grouped in 3 and 1, because we have in the time 3, 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Quite an unusual thing to do. It's very sort of almost a stop-start rhythm, but I think that's because John started with this unusual 6/8, and then they got ironed out into 4/4, and then they added the shuffle. So you've got this evolution of rhythm.
Of course.
Yeah, and of course, on the rhythm side, Ringo is really just playing bass drum on this.
Yeah.
And very effectively. And it starts off, with double beats, and then you got dun dun dun. It just, you know, that's his drum pattern.
And it kind of fills the gaps because you got Ringo sings his line, "Town where I was born," and in the spaces is where you get the kick drum.
Yeah.
So once again, like we're discussing on previous songs, there's never a dull moment in the Beatles song.
No.
Anytime there's a gap in the vocal, something will come through and fill it.
Mm-hmm. And even his bass drums, it's not 1, 2. He doesn't stick to a pattern. It's 1, 2, and then it's dum dum dum.
Yeah.
You know, it's
Yeah,
more
it
of
varies.
a melodic character to it than just the background thing.
And musically, all those little moments, the drop the cable, cut the cable, you know, these are all, the Beatles were just having fun. They were sort of, and George Martin was able to
facilitate
it all due to his experience on comedy records, like the Goons.
I guess, that would have been an important element as well of George's experience working with sound effects and the Goons and other, Peter Sellers and other artists. It's a mishmash. When it is the odd one out on the Revolver album, which is a lot of people consider is the Beatles' finest. Whether they consider Yellow Submarine is the finest track, I don't know. But
we can all appreciate it as a great children's track, a great, sort of memorable track.
Yeah.
Does it fit with Here, There and Everywhere? Such a beautiful track? I don't know, but it's certainly...
That's the thing about every
memorable.
album had so many varied tracks, so many different styles of music, every single album. You just never knew what was coming next.
That's what makes them so special, is they didn't feel confined into a style. They weren't just replicating what they did last time. They were always pushing forward.
Paul's love of kind of music hall and comedy and traditional English entertainment. He's always loved that. Really.
And the English not nursery rhymes, English stories and almost sea shanties make their way into this. It's got sort of, you could imagine Liverpool dock songs be an influence for this. Lewis Carroll could be an influence. It sounds like he's...
Yeah, I think you're right.
Stuff up from his childhood.
This is the Beatles' sea shanty song, without doubt. Yes.
And just going through the lyrics, let's talk about sort of little moments and little words here and there. The whole song is, although simple and childlike, it's leaning into that psychedelic aspect of the Beatles' music, which had been coming since 1965 into 66. Tomorrow Never Knows has been recorded. She Said is going to be on this album. These are psychedelic songs. Yellow Submarine is psychedelic in its own way.
Well, it kind of became psychedelic just with the imagery and the title, and it was just it became very much also a kind of a focus and just the idea of a yellow submarine. What the hell is that, really? But it was the swinging 60s, and it was a colourful song.
And we can talk about the moments of the Beatles having fun we've quickly touched on before, but John mirroring Ringo's vocals in the last
response.
Call and response.
It's just another great example of they never let a section happen twice without something different happening. Because that verse, we've already heard it quite a few times throughout the song, but John comes back. John comes and peppers in these funny little responses to what Ringo's saying.
Speaking through a megaphone as well.
Yeah, I think they did it in the... There would have been a room at Abbey Road with the big plates to create reverb.
Yeah, the echo chamber.
Yeah, the echo chamber.
Yeah, too.
I think he just went in there and was just larking around, and that's what they got.
I know they did that for all the cut the cable, drop the cable, comedic bits, but for the in our yellow that comes through the speaker, sounds like a megaphone. He put that through his amp.
Oh, that makes more sense. Yeah,
which was Mal Evans, the roadie's idea.
Gives it that sort of as you said, megaphone sound effect.
Which is great. Like they were always.
So he recorded the mic through the amp. Okay, that's
that makes sense. Yeah, it slightly masks his voice as well. Obviously we know it's John, but it sounds like some sort of weird character.
And we'll just go through the lyrics again. It's not. Some people have said it's a reference to drugs. We can't say it is, and I don't think it is because it was written as a children's song, but surely drugs were now becoming quite a large part of the Beatles' life, and anything that leaned into that, they were willing to do or accept. Tomorrow Never Knows was about an acid trip that John had. She Said was about an acid trip John had. Surely the imagery of Yellow Submarine is playing into this as well.
I think there's an element of that, and whether you were into Purple Hearts or Yellow Submarines back in the day, you know, whatever drug turns you on, basically.
And the song came out on the same day that Revolver was released.
Yes.
Bit of a strange decision to release two songs that were on the album and the album on the same day.
I guess so, but for Beatles fans, we didn't care. And I'm sure I bought both of them on the first day of release. I would have been 13 years old. And yeah, well, you got extra value, an album and a single, a double A-side single, which itself was quite unusual, really. That was the first time they did that. And of course, well, they were lucky that, unlike Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields the year later, which didn't make number one, only number two, Eleanor Rigby at Yellow Submarine went straight to the top.
In the UK.
Yeah.
Kept off the top spot in the US by You Can't Hurry Love by the Supremes.
Ah, yes.
It's a major hit.
Yeah.
A lot of people are
hard to compete with that track.
Hard to compete with it, obviously. And I think at the time, the sort of furore around We're Bigger Than Jesus comments and the Yesterday and Today Butcher cover with the sort of mangled toy babies on the front had caused a stir in America.
Yeah.
So I think it was a mix of a great hit, keeping them off the top spot, and some controversy.
And I'm interested, I'm not even sure which track got the most airplay in the UK, because they were both being played, and I need to check which one actually was the most popular on the radio.
But it's such an odd pairing. They're both quite odd songs in their own right, and then the Rigby, Yellow Submarine, quite unlike anything else the Beatles have done. And then paired together, it's such an odd couple, but you know, it's classic Beatles.
I do have a fact of why they were paired. They believed that these were the two that were going to be the most covered songs, if not released as hits, and they thought people are going to get hits with Eleanor Rigby and people are going to get hits with Yellow Submarine if we don't release as a single and get the hit first. Although it was coming out on the album, they were like, let's you know, get in there first.
Oh, that's interesting.
And to justify it to themselves, they said, well, albums normally have 12 songs, we have 14, so you're actually getting 2 extra songs.
Right,
so you can buy the record, you can buy the single and the album.
Yeah.
And we've got to touch on the film. The Yellow Submarine film, released 2 years later.
Well, that's right, and I think the film was put into production very soon after the song came out. You know, the producers realised, oh, this is a great subject. It's a kids song, you know, and for a cartoon. So the work certainly began on the film in '66, because it was only released just under 2 years later, in July '68. So very fast work with incredible animations, and that's for me, the most iconic animated film from the '60s, which I was lucky enough to be at the premiere of in 1968.
Tell us a little bit more then about your premiere story.
Oh, well, I was, by then I was 15, and I was with a pal, and we went down to the premiere just to hang out outside the London Pavilion Cinema in Piccadilly Circus. We were there in the afternoon for an hour or so until I saw somebody going into the side door at the cinema, followed him in, ended up going up a lift to the roof of the cinema, spending a couple of hours on the roof. It's a long story, I won't bore you with it, but anyway, managed to get into the cinema after being challenged by the manager, and I bluffed my way in, basically, until we had no seats. Then all the Beatles came in, and they all walked past us. We're standing at the back of the circle. They all walked down to the front of the dress circle, first row, as Paul and John, George and Ringo. I see 2 seats behind them, right as the paparazzi were kind of backing off. And the third seat along is Keith Richards from the Stones. So I walked down with my pal, and I said, excuse me, is anyone sitting there? He says, nah, you're okay, it's Mick and Marianne. But so I sat next to Keith Richards, literally behind Paul McCartney that night.
Amazing.
Oh, wow. And the film is so iconic as well, 60s imagery and psychedelic animations, it became sort of synonymous with this imagery of the time, of that sort of 60s
Well, you had
flower
a mix
power.
of amazing artwork in the sequences for Lucy in the Sky and one or two others. Brilliant artwork with more traditional cartoon, which is, most of the film is very, wonderfully colourful cartoons with old Fred looking for his music. It's been banned in submarine
And
land.
the Beatles were only in it at the very end, in a little clip, right? Singing All Together Now. Because, I didn't realise when I was a kid watching it, but they don't voice themselves in the film.
Yeah, the actors.
Yeah.
And supposedly their appearance at the end was the way of getting out their contract to say that they appeared in the film.
Right.
I think
So they didn't have to do any work, but,
Yeah.
but got out of their contract to say, we've done now 3 films with United Artists
Right, yeah.
Productions. We'll just quickly wrap up and talk about the impact of Yellow Submarine. It becomes a nursery rhyme the world over, and it becomes a chant. You hear it at protests, you hear it at football games. It's that easy quality, sing-along quality is what makes it so memorable.
Not just melodically, but the template of the lyric is so easy to then map onto something else, because we all live in a yellow submarine, and then you just repeat yellow submarine, yellow submarine. So you could fit all sorts of different lyrics into that gap, making it so malleable.
Oh yeah, the one moment I remember having sat at the premiere in '68 was coming outside the cinema afterwards with about, I think, 60, 70,000 people outside all chanting the chorus line, "We all live in a yellow submarine," non-stop.
Wow.
And that was an incredible experience.
Yeah.
I always remember that.
There you have it. We've put the link for the song below. The only thing that's left for you to do is sit back, put on the record, relax, and float downstream. Also, help us by subscribing to UnBeatled on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. I'll see you next time for Pennyline.